In the closing days of the 5th century, the world that had been Gaul, jewel of the Western Roman Empire, stood on the edge of an abyss. For centuries, the Roman eagle had cast its shadow over these lands. Legions had marched its roads, governors had spoken its laws, and marble cities had reflected the grandeur of an empire that claimed eternity. But eternity had an end. In 476 CE, the Western Empire collapsed. Its last emperor dethroned, its armies dissolved, its authority scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. The Roman world that had bound Gaul together, in law, in trade, in the iron discipline of its legions, vanished almost overnight. In its place yawned a vacuum, and in that vacuum the old certainties crumbled. The mighty roads still stretched to the horizon, but they carried no imperial orders. Marketplaces that had once overflowed with goods from every corner of the Mediterranean now stood thinly stocked, their stalls quiet beneath the weight of fear. The law courts fell silent. Coins lost their value. Bandits and warlords ruled where governors once sat. Yet history does not leave a land empty for long. From the forests and river valleys, from beyond the Rhine and the Pyrenees, new powers stirred. Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians, Saxons, and others, each seeking to carve a kingdom from Rome's abandoned prize. Gaul became the battleground of tribes and ambitions, its fate uncertain, its people caught between memory and survival. It is in this crucible of collapse and chaos that the story of medieval France begins, not with a single kingdom, but with the slow forging of one. Over the centuries that followed, leaders would rise and fall, warriors who could unite the tribes, kings who would bind themselves to the church, generals who would defend Christendom against the Crescent, and rulers who would see their empires splinter. Dynasties would be born, crowned in glory and humbled by the tide of time. From the shadow of Clovis's conquests to the grandeur of Charlemagne's empire, from the ruin of its partition to the fragile rebirth under Hugh Capet, the journey would span 5 centuries of struggle. This was not a straight path from darkness to light, but a long and perilous climb, where the crown itself often seemed too heavy to bear, and the unity of the realm hung by a thread. Yet through war and ruin, invasion and betrayal, one truth remained. The seed of France had been planted, and though it would take generations to grow, it would root itself so deeply that no storm could uproot it. What follows is the story of how a land, once the heart of a fallen empire, became the heart of a new kingdom, forged in the fire of chaos, tempered by the patience of kings, and destined to become France. And so, in that widening void where Rome's power had once stood unshakable, the story of medieval France began to take shape. The legion's silence was not merely the end of an army. It was the drumbeat to which a new age marched. From the moment the eagles were lowered, the roads and cities of Gaul became the anvil upon which warriors, kings, and invaders would hammer out the destiny of a fractured land. The fall of the legions. The day the eagles were lowered. It was the year 476 CE, and the legions that had once thundered across the known world were now shadows of themselves. Once, the roads of Gaul had echoed with the measured cadence of iron-shod boots, the creak of leather harnesses, the glint of disciplined ranks moving as one under the golden standard of the eagle. Now those same roads lay cracked and empty, their stones loosened by years of neglect, grass forcing its way between them like the slow fingers of time reclaiming the land. The Roman army, the living symbol of order and invincibility, was unraveling. It did not fall in a single dramatic battle, but in a slow, grinding dissolution. Soldiers were not cut down by the sword, but by hunger, by unpaid wages, by the corrosive certainty that Rome no longer had the strength to command their loyalty. Veterans went home to tend small plots of land. Younger recruits deserted to join local war bands, pledging allegiance to whoever could offer them food and coin. Fortresses that had guarded the frontiers for centuries stood unmanned, their gates swinging open in the wind. The collapse of the legions was more than a military failure. It was the breaking of Rome's spine. For centuries, the army had been the shield of civilization in Gaul, the unyielding wall that kept chaos at bay. Without it, the frontiers were no longer lines on a map. They were open wounds. Raiders tested them first with cautious probes, then with bolder incursions, until the flood could no longer be stopped. And as the legions melted away, so too did the invisible machinery of empire. The proud hierarchy of governors, magistrates, and scribes, the intricate web of Roman administration, began to wither. The tax collectors stopped coming, not because taxes were no longer due, but because there was no army to enforce their collection. Courts stood empty. Disputes were settled not by Roman law, but by the sword or the whim of local strongmen. Edicts from distant emperors arrived late, if at all, and when they did, no one listened. In the cities, the marble-clad basilicas where justice had been spoken now housed grain stores or stood abandoned, pigeons nesting in the rafters. The law itself, once the most formidable achievement of Rome, became a relic, surviving only in memory and parchment scrolls that few could read. The principles that had bound together peoples from the Atlantic to the Black Sea were replaced by the crude codes of warlords and tribal chiefs. The idea of citizenship, that proud title of Roman, lost its meaning in a land where the empire's reach had withered to nothing. For the common people of Gaul, the change was not marked by declarations or ceremonies, but by the slow dimming of the world they had known. Roads were less safe, markets less full, winter colder without the grain shipments that had once flowed along the empire's arteries. The great aqueducts still stood against the sky, but the fountains in the towns ran dry. Even the Latin tongue, once the music of law and power, began to mingle with the rougher sounds of Germanic speech. The fall of the army was the fall of order, and with the legions gone, the land was exposed, not just to foreign steel, but to the deeper invasion of uncertainty and fear. The eagle standards, carried proudly into battle for centuries, were lowered for the last time. Some were hidden away in private shrines, relics of a glory no one believed would return. Others were captured, their golden wings melted down by the hands of those who had once trembled before them. It was the end of an age. The empire had not died in a blaze of heroic last stands. It had bled out slowly, leaving Gaul unguarded. And in the silence that followed, the air seemed to wait, heavy, expectant, for the next power to rise from the ruins. The gathering storm, when new lords rose from the ashes. And so, when the eagles were lowered and the legions faded into memory, Gaul stood naked beneath the sky. The land, once bound together by imperial command, now lay like an unguarded prize. Its fields still yielded grain, its rivers still glittered under the sun, and its towns still clung to the bones of Roman grandeur. But there was no master to claim them. Into this void came the first contenders. Some were already here, the sons and grandsons of tribes who had once served as Rome's foederati, allies in name, mercenaries in truth. They knew the roads, the rivers, the fertile valleys, and they knew the people, for they had lived alongside them for generations. Others came from beyond the old frontiers, crossing forests and mountains as predators crossed the borders of abandoned lands. The Burgundians swept in from the east, settling along the Rhone, carving out their own realm from what had once been Roman provinces. To the south, the Visigoths held sway in Aquitaine, their horsemen moving with the ease of men who had long mastered both war and diplomacy. But it was from the north and northeast that the most relentless force emerged, the Franks. The Franks were not a single united nation, but a tapestry of warrior bands bound by blood, oath, and the promise of plunder. They were a people of the rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Scheldt, and they moved like the rivers themselves, sometimes meandering, sometimes flooding without warning. Where Rome had built walls, they tested them. Where Rome had raised towns, they eyed them as spoils. Yet unlike mere raiders, the Franks came not only to take, but to stay. In village after village, the people of Gaul began to see new faces sitting in judgment, new hands collecting tribute. The language in the market shifted. Latin now spoken with the rough consonants of Germanic tongues. Roman law still clung stubbornly in some cities, but beyond their gates, it was the law of the sword that prevailed. Local strongmen, once minor players under imperial rule, now crowned themselves lords, their legitimacy resting not on distant emperors, but on the number of warriors they could command. It was a dangerous age, but also an age of opportunity. For centuries, Rome had been the sole arbiter of power, crushing any rival before it could rise. Now, power was anyone's to seize. Alliances were forged in the smoke of hearths and the blood of battlefields. Borders shifted like the tide, like today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and the man you fought beside at dawn might be your rival by dusk. Yet there was method in the chaos. These tribes, Frank, Burgundian, Visigoth, each saw themselves as heirs, not merely to the land, but to the mantle of Rome's authority. They adopted its titles, mimicked its ceremonies, and spoke of their kings as if they were emperors in waiting. They might scorn the decadence of the empire, but they coveted its prestige. In the countryside, farmers plowed the same furrows their fathers had, but now under the gaze of different masters. In the towns, merchants learned to weigh not just the value of their wares, but the mood of the warlord who controlled the gates. Priests prayed for stability, yet quietly adapted their sermons to please the new rulers. Gaul had become a chessboard without a king, and every piece on it, from petty chieftain to ambitious warlord, dreamed of being crowned. The old order had fallen, but in its ruins the seeds of new kingdoms were taking root. Among them, one would grow to overshadow all others, guided by a young war leader who would wield both the sword and the cross. His name had not yet thundered across the land, but soon it would. Clovis. The Age of Shadows, when the people walked without shelter. But the rise of new lords did not bring peace. Power had changed hands, yet the land remained restless. For the common people of Gaul, life in the shadow of these shifting banners was not measured by the ambitions of kings, but by the daily struggle to survive. Gone were the steady patrols of Roman legionaries who once kept the roads safe from brigands. Now travelers moved in wary clusters, armed with whatever they could carry, a hunting spear, a woodcutter's axe, a knife tucked into a belt. Bandits lurked in the forests, striking not only at merchants, but at the poorest farmer returning from market. A man could leave his village at sunrise and never be seen again, swallowed by the lawless wild. The marketplaces that had once bustled with the wealth of a continent began to wither. In the days of Rome, merchants had brought olive oil from Hispania, glassware from the East, spices from Africa, all moving along the great arteries of trade. But now, with no empire to guard the routes, caravans dwindled. Ships avoided ports plagued by pirates. River crossings became toll points controlled by whichever warlord claimed them that week. The flow of goods slowed to a trickle, and with it, the wealth and variety of life ebbed away. In the towns, artisans found fewer buyers for their work. Smiths still forged blades, but most went to warriors rather than farmers. Potters made jars, but they were coarse and plain, meant for necessity, not beauty. The finer things, the embroidered cloth, the carved ivory, the polished bronze, became rare, hoarded by the new elite as symbols of status and power. Even coinage, once the empire's lifeblood, began to vanish from daily use, replaced by barter. Grain for wool, tools for salt, a promise of protection in exchange for a share of the harvest. Fear seeped into every corner of life. Nightfall came with the knowledge that raiders might strike before dawn. Not only foreign warriors, but men from the next valley, driven by hunger or greed. Villages huddled closer together, ringed by crude palisades. Fires were banked low to avoid drawing attention. Church bells rang not just for mass, but as warnings of danger. Yet in this darkness, the spirit of the people did not die. They adapted. Farmers learned to hide their grain in secret pits. Shepherds moved their flocks into the hills at the first sign of danger. Women became the keepers of family memory, teaching children the stories of better times so they would remember that the world had once been ordered, that justice had once walked among men. Priests and monks became more than spiritual guides. They were scribes, healers, and negotiators between villagers and warlords. Still, the truth was inescapable. Gaul was a land fractured. The proud unity of the imperial days had been replaced by a patchwork of petty domains, each jealously guarding what little it had. Trade, the thread that had once bound provinces into a single fabric, now lay frayed and tangled. And without the constant movement of goods and ideas, the land began to turn inward, each village an island in a sea of uncertainty. It was an age of shadows, not a complete darkness, but a dim twilight between what had been and what was yet to come. The people endured, but they did so without the certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. And yet, in the midst of this uncertainty, a few saw the truth. Chaos could not last forever. A hand would rise to unite the land, to bring back the order the people yearned for. The tribes had tested their strength. Now they awaited a leader who could bind them together, not by fear alone, but by the promise of something greater. The rise of the Wolf King, Clovis, and the forging of a nation. But in every age of shadows, there comes a figure who walks with the stride of destiny. In the tangled chaos of Gaul's petty warlords, that figure was a young Frankish chieftain named Clovis. He was no ordinary son of the Rhine. Even as a boy, he carried himself with the confidence of one who believed the land itself was waiting for his hand upon the hilt. Clovis inherited more than a sword from his father, Childeric. He inherited a fragment of power, a small but well-forged core of loyal warriors. In an age when allegiances shifted with the wind, loyalty was gold, and Clovis had it in abundance. His men would ride with him through rain, mud, and blood, knowing that their fortunes rose and fell with his. At first, Clovis was just one lord among many, another wolf in the pack. But he had something the others lacked: vision. Where most chiefs were content to guard their corner of land, Clovis saw all the Franks as one people, divided by rivalries, weakened by pride, yet bound by blood and the hunger for glory. He knew that a united Frankish nation could rule not just the forests and rivers of the north, but all of Gaul. His rise began with calculated strikes against his neighbors. One by one, rival chieftains fell before him, some in battle, others through carefully crafted alliances sealed with marriage or oath. His blade was swift, but his mind sharper still. Clovis did not merely win territory. He absorbed the warriors and resources of those he defeated, forging each victory into a stepping stone toward something greater. The turning point came with the Battle of Soissons. It was not only a clash of arms, but a statement to every Frankish lord watching from the shadows. Clovis was no longer a contender. He was the contender. His disciplined ranks and ruthless decisiveness shattered his opponents. The spoils of that victory did more than fill his coffers. They filled his legend. Yet Clovis's greatest trial lay not against his fellow Franks, but against the Alemanni, fierce warriors who threatened his growing domain from the east. The confrontation came at Tolbiac. There the Alemanni fought with the fury of men defending their very existence, and for a time the tide of battle turned against Clovis. His warriors began to waver. It was then, in the heart of the struggle, that Clovis is said to have called upon the Christian God, a God he had not yet embraced, but whom his Burgundian wife Clotilde had urged him to trust. Whether by divine will or the unbreakable resolve of a commander who refused to yield, the tide turned. The Alemanni king fell, and with him the resistance of his people. In the aftermath, Clovis stood not only as a conqueror, but as the unchallenged master of the Frankish tribes. His victories were not merely military, they were political, cultural, and symbolic. By uniting the Franks under one crown, he had transformed them from a loose confederation of warbands into a kingdom. The wolf had become a king. But even as his power solidified, Clovis understood that swords alone could not bind a nation. The tribes he had gathered needed more than fear of his wrath. They needed a banner to rally under, a shared faith to give them one heart and one destiny. That moment would come soon, and when it did, the Frankish realm would step out of the age of shadows and into the dawn of something greater. The crown and the cross. Clovis embraces the faith. Victory at Tolbiac had given Clovis the sword of kingship, but he knew that a sword alone could not hold a kingdom together. The Franks had been united in war, yet peace required something stronger than fear. It required belief. It required a cause greater than any one man. Clovis had long resisted the urgings of his wife, Queen Clotilde, a devout Catholic of Burgundian blood, who had pleaded with him to abandon the old gods of his ancestors. The Frankish kings before him had trusted in the thunder of Wotan, the war lust of Donar, the whispers of the ancient spirits. To turn from them was no small step. It was to renounce the very traditions that bound his warriors to him. But the day at Tolbiac had planted a seed. In the heat of battle, when the Alemanni pressed hard and the lines of the Franks began to break, Clovis had called upon the Christian God for aid. Victory had followed. Was it chance? Or had the God of the Romans and the Gauls heard his voice? For a man like Clovis, who believed in destiny, the question was not lightly set aside. In the months that followed, Clovis weighed his choice. Christianity offered more than salvation for the soul. It offered an alliance with the most powerful institution left standing in the ruins of the Western Empire, the Catholic Church. Through its bishops and priests, the Church's influence reached into every city, every village, every hearth. To rule with the Church's blessing was to rule not only in the name of a king, but in the name of God. And so, in the winter of the year 496, Clovis made his decision. He would embrace the faith of his queen, and in doing so, he would bind his crown to the cross. The ceremony was held in Reims, a city whose ancient stones had witnessed both Roman triumph and barbarian conquest. Bishop Remigius, clad in the vestments of his office, stood before the gathered host. The air was thick with incense and the murmured prayers of the faithful. Clovis approached the font not as a defeated pagan abandoning his gods, but as a victorious king claiming the patronage of heaven. As the water flowed over his head, the words of the bishop rang out. "Bend thy head, proud Sicambrian. Burn what thou hast adored, and adore what thou hast burned." It was both a command and a prophecy. In that moment, Clovis became more than the ruler of the Franks. He became the chosen champion of Catholic Gaul. Thousands of his warriors followed him into the faith, their swords now sworn to the service of Christ. The Church, in turn, embraced Clovis as its protector, granting him a moral authority that no pagan rival could match. In the eyes of his subjects, his victories were no longer merely the work of a skilled warlord. They were signs of divine favor. This alliance was as strategic as it was spiritual. By siding with the Catholic Church, Clovis set himself apart from the Arian Christian kings who ruled other barbarian realms, such as the Visigoths and Ostrogoths. It gave him the mantle of orthodoxy, the right to claim that he, and he alone, ruled with the true faith. In the political chessboard of post-Roman Europe, that was a weapon as sharp as any blade. From this moment forward, the kingdom of the Franks was no longer just a patchwork of conquered tribes. It was a Christian realm, bound by the cross and guided by a king who saw himself as God's instrument on earth. And with this sacred alliance, Clovis's vision stretched far beyond the borders of his present domain. The Franks had been a people. Now, they would become a nation. The hammer of Gaul, forging a kingdom, with the crown bound to the cross, Clovis now possessed what no other ruler in Gaul could claim: the union of military might and divine legitimacy. His throne stood upon two unshakable pillars: the loyalty of his warriors and the blessing of the Church. From this foundation, he set his eyes on a prize greater than any single victory: the unification of nearly all Gaul under the banner of the Franks. The land he sought to master was vast and fractured, a quilt of Roman ruins, tribal domains, and half-forgotten cities still clinging to their faded Latin dignity. Yet it was rich beyond measure: fertile valleys, trade rivers, and strategic fortresses scattered across the heart of Western Europe. In the right hands, it could be the beating heart of a new empire. Clovis moved with the precision of a man who knew time favored the bold. He struck first at lingering rivals among the Franks themselves, ensuring no chief could challenge his supremacy. Each conquest was followed not by destruction, but by careful integration. The defeated were offered a place in his growing realm. Their warriors absorbed into his armies, their lands folded into his dominion. But his true test lay to the south: the Visigothic kingdom, whose power stretched from the Pyrenees deep into Hispania, and whose hold over southern Gaul stood as the last great barrier to Frankish supremacy. The Visigoths were formidable, their cavalry swift, their warriors hardened by years of rule. Yet they bore a fatal flaw: their Arian faith set them apart from the Catholic majority of the land they ruled. Clovis, champion of Catholicism, wielded this difference as a weapon. In the year 507, the two powers met at the Battle of Vouillé. It was a clash not only of armies but of destinies: Catholic Frank against Arian Visigoth, the future against the fading shadow of post-Roman rule. Clovis led from the front, his sword flashing in the thick of battle. The fighting was fierce, but the Franks' resolve and numbers told in the end. The Visigothic king, Alaric II, fell, and with him, the last serious obstacle to Frankish dominance in Gaul. The victory was more than territorial. It was symbolic, proof that the Franks were not merely another barbarian tribe, but the inheritors of Roman Gaul's legacy. City after city opened its gates, not only in fear, but in hope that under Clovis they would find stability after generations of uncertainty. The Church, already his ally, now celebrated him as the defender of the faith and the unifier of the realm. By the final years of his reign, Clovis's kingdom stretched from the Loire in the south to the Rhine in the east, and from the Pyrenees to the edges of the North Sea. He had forged a realm that was neither wholly Roman nor wholly barbarian, but something new, a fusion of traditions, laws, and cultures that would form the bedrock of medieval France. Clovis died in 511, leaving his kingdom to his sons, but his legacy endured. He had taken a land torn by war, faith, and division, and hammered it into a kingdom that could stand against the storms of the age. The Franks were no longer just a name on the lips of their neighbors. They were a power to be reckoned with, a nation poised to shape the destiny of Europe. The age of petty chieftains was over. The age of kings had begun. The Shadow Throne. When kings wore crowns, but others held the scepter. Clovis had built his kingdom with fire and steel, but no blade, however sharp, can cut through the slow rust of complacency. When the great king died in 511, he left behind not one united throne, but four, divided among his sons in accordance with Frankish custom. It was a dangerous inheritance, for the blood that bound brothers often ran thinner than the wine poured at their feasts. In the decades that followed, the realm of the Franks remained vast, wealthy, and feared. Yet the fierce energy of Clovis's reign began to ebb. His sons and grandsons still wore the long hair that was the badge of Merovingian royalty, but the hands beneath their golden circlets grew idle. The line of warrior kings gave way to monarchs who preferred the pleasures of the hunt, the luxury of the hall, and the intrigue of court life over the rigors of governance. The Frankish people still looked to their king as a symbol, the sacred descendant of Clovis, chosen by God and crowned in the name of the Church. But symbols do not levy armies, negotiate treaties, or guard the frontiers. As royal attention drifted from statecraft, others stepped forward to fill the void. At the heart of the royal court was the office of the mayor of the palace, mayor domus. Once little more than the chief steward of the royal household, the mayor's role expanded as the Merovingian kings receded into ceremonial grandeur. The mayor commanded the royal estates, controlled the treasury, oversaw the distribution of lands and titles, and, most importantly, held direct command over the realm's armies. In time, this was no mere servant. It was the true master of the kingdom in all but name. By the 7th century, the mayors of the palace had become the architects of Frankish destiny. They made war and peace, chose which rival claimants to support, and even decided which royal edicts would be enforced. Kings still presided at grand councils, but it was the mayor who shaped the decisions before they ever reached the throne. Some monarchs resented this usurpation, but few had the will or ability to reclaim their authority. Thus was born the legend of the Roi Fainéant, the do-nothing kings. Yet to dismiss these kings entirely would be to misunderstand their role in the Frankish imagination. They remained the anointed figureheads, the living link to Clovis and his sacred baptism at Rheims. They traveled in state, their hair long and flowing as the symbol of royal sanctity, their mere presence enough to inspire awe among the people. But in matters of power, their hands were tied with silken cords woven by the mayors who served and ruled them. The most powerful of these mayors arose from the noble family of the Pippinids, who would, in time, reshape the very nature of Frankish kingship. From their strongholds in Austrasia, the eastern Frankish lands, they extended their influence across the realm, marrying their children into royal and noble houses, forging alliances, and proving themselves unmatched in both war and diplomacy. The relationship between king and mayor became a delicate dance. The monarch might bestow titles and honors upon his mayor, but he was often as dependent upon him as a ship is upon its captain. The mayor, in turn, might profess loyalty and service to the crown, even as he wielded the scepter of decision in the shadows. For the people of Gaul, this was an age of subtle transformation. The realm still bore the name of the Merovingians, but the pulse of its governance beat to another rhythm. The church continued to bless the kings, but it also cultivated close ties with the mayors, who proved themselves indispensable patrons of monasteries, protectors of bishops, and defenders of Christian lands against pagan and heretical foes. Wars were still fought, against Saxons, Frisians, and Lombards, but they were fought under banners chosen by the mayor's hand. Diplomacy was still conducted, but its terms were decided in the mayor's council chambers. The borders of the realm still shifted and expanded, but at the will of those who sat behind the throne rather than upon it. In this way, the Merovingian court became a theater in which the outward grandeur of kingship masked the inward truth of power. The long-haired kings, seated upon their jeweled thrones, were actors playing the role their lineage demanded. The mayors of the palace, moving through the corridors of command, were the directors shaping the drama. It was a situation that could not last forever. Power that hides behind a crown eventually begins to wonder whether it should wear the crown itself. In the decades to come, the Pippinid mayors, skilled, ambitious, and utterly confident in their right to rule, would test the limits of this shadow arrangement. And when they did, the age of the lazy kings would give way to something entirely new. For now, though, the kingdom of the Franks lived under a dual order, the visible majesty of Merovingian tradition and the unseen but undeniable rule of the mayoral hand. It was a balance of symbols and substance, of ritual and reality, and it set the stage for the next great transformation in the history of France, the fractured crown, when the realm became a tapestry of lords. Yet even as the mayors of the palace tightened their grip on the machinery of the Frankish state, another force began to pull the realm apart. It did not come from foreign invasion or open rebellion, but from within, from the very structure of land, loyalty, and power that had sustained the kingdom since Clovis's time. For in the Frankish order, the king, and later the mayor, ruled not directly over every village, but through lords, men of noble blood or proven valor, entrusted with lands in return for service. These lands were not merely estates. They were miniature realms, complete with their own warriors, courts, and laws. At first, these lords were vassals in the truest sense, their fortunes tied to the throne. But as the generations passed, their loyalty shifted, from the distant crown to the soil beneath their feet. The bonds of fealty, once strong and personal, began to fray. A noble might still swear allegiance to the king, but his first duty was now to protect his own lands, enrich his own house, and pass his inheritance to his sons. Castles rose on hilltops, not as royal fortresses, but as the private strongholds of lords who answered to no one, unless it suited their interests. In the absence of a strong and present monarch, these lords discovered that their authority was limited only by their ability to defend it. Many began to mint their own coins, dispense their own justice, and raise armies loyal not to the kingdom, but to themselves. What had been the united realm of Clovis slowly became a mosaic of semi-independent territories. This was not yet full disintegration. The Frankish identity still bound these lands, and the church still provided a thread of unity. Bishops and abbots, often drawn from the same noble families, acted as mediators between local power and the central authority. But the balance was shifting. When a royal summons came, a lord might answer, or he might claim pressing business on his own borders. In some regions, neighboring lords allied with each other more readily than with the crown, forging networks of influence that rivaled royal authority. Marriage became a weapon as potent as the sword, joining houses into sprawling dynasties that could challenge the mayor himself. In the courts of these great nobles, diplomacy, intrigue, and quiet defiance became the tools of survival. For the common people, the change was double-edged. A powerful local lord might protect his peasants better than a distant king could, guarding them from raiders and ensuring the harvest was stored safely. But such protection came at a cost: heavier taxes, compulsory labor, and the expectation that every able-bodied man would take up arms when the Lord called. In war, it was not the king's banner they followed, but the colors of their own master. Geography deepened the divide. The Frankish realm stretched across a vast and varied land, from the storm-battered coasts of the north to the sunlit valleys of Aquitaine, from the dense forests of Austrasia to the wine-rich hills near the Rhone. Roads were poor and communication slow. In such conditions, local autonomy was not merely a choice, but a necessity. A king's decree sent from the palace might take weeks to reach a distant province, and by the time it arrived, the lord there had already decided how matters would be settled. The mayors of the palace, for all their power, could not be everywhere at once. They depended on the cooperation of these nobles, rewarding loyalty with greater privileges and punishing defiance only when it threatened the heart of the realm. But every concession made to secure peace was another thread pulled from the fabric of centralized power. By the dawn of the 8th century, the Frankish kingdom was a paradox, vast in name but fragmented in fact. The title of king still commanded respect, and the mayor's authority still loomed large, but the daily reality of governance lay in the hands of scores of lords, each a master in his own hall. The realm had become a patchwork of sovereignties, bound together not by direct control, but by a shifting web of obligations, oaths, and convenience. This was the seedbed of feudalism, though it would not yet bear its full shape. The patterns were already clear: land in exchange for service, protection in exchange for obedience, loyalty measured not by abstract allegiance to a realm, but by the personal bond between lord and vassal. It was a system that could endure for centuries, and one that could just as easily tear itself apart when ambition outweighed duty. In this fractured order, opportunity and danger walked hand in hand. For a leader bold enough to command both the respect of the nobles and the loyalty of their warriors, the kingdom could be drawn together again. But for the complacent or the weak, the lords could tighten their grip until the crown itself became little more than an ornament. And so the stage was set for the rise of a figure who could master this delicate balance, a man who would not merely hold the realm together, but defend it from threats far greater than the ambitions of its own nobility. That man would soon step from the ranks of the mayors themselves, wielding the sword not only against his rivals at home, but against a tide of invaders from beyond Christendom's edge. The Wall of Tours, Charles Martel, and the turning of the tide. Amid this patchwork of lords and divided loyalties, a single man began to rise above the rest. He was not a king, in name at least, but he wielded more power than any Merovingian who still wore the crown. Charles, son of the formidable Pippin of Herstal, had inherited neither throne nor unchallenged authority, but through sheer will and relentless skill in war, he carved out his place. His enemies called him Martel, the hammer, for when he struck to break. Charles's time would prove that the unity of the Franks could not be forged in council halls alone. It had to be tested on the battlefield, and the greatest test of all came not from within the Frankish realm, but from the south, across the Pyrenees. For decades, the armies of Islam had surged outward from Arabia, sweeping through the Middle East, North Africa, and into Iberia. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate held nearly all of Hispania under its banner. In 732, their forces crossed into Gaul, not as raiders, but as conquerors, their eyes set on the rich cities of Aquitaine and beyond. The first shock fell upon Duke Odo of Aquitaine, who faced the Muslim general Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi near Bordeaux. Odo's forces were crushed, the land left open to the invaders' advance. In desperation, the Duke turned north, to the man he had once resisted, and placed his cause in Charles Martel's hands. Charles did not hesitate. Whatever rivalries had divided Gaul's lords, the threat now was greater than any feud. If the Umayyads broke through, the heart of the Frankish realm would lie open. Calling his warriors from Austrasia and beyond, Charles marched south, not as a feudal lord defending his own, but as the defender of all Christendom in the west. The two armies met between Tours and Poitiers in the chill of autumn. The Muslim cavalry, swift and deadly, outnumbered Charles's infantry, but the hammer understood his enemy. He anchored his men in a solid defensive formation on high ground, shield locked to shield, spears braced, refusing to be drawn into rash pursuit. For 7 days they faced one another, each testing the other's resolve. When the Umayyad charge finally came, it was a storm of hooves and steel. The Frankish line bent but did not break. Charles himself moved among his warriors, his presence steadying the ranks, his orders crisp and unyielding. Again and again the cavalry struck, but the wall of Frankish shields held firm, cutting down rider after rider. In the chaos of battle, word spread through the Muslim ranks that their camp, and its treasures, was being plundered. Discipline faltered. The Franks seized their moment. Charles gave the signal, and his men surged forward, breaking the enemy's cohesion and driving them from the field. Abd al-Rahman was slain, and his army scattered, retreating back across the Pyrenees. The victory at Tours was more than a battle won. It was a line drawn across history. In the eyes of the Christian world, Charles Martel had turned back the tide of Islam in the West. The Pope and the Church hailed him as the champion of the faith, the defender of Europe. In the hearts of his warriors, he was more than a mayor. He was the protector of the realm, a king in all but title. For the Frankish nobility, the battle proved an undeniable truth. In an age when kings sat idle and lords guarded only their own, it was Charles who could rally them to a single cause and lead them to victory. His reputation, already formidable, became unshakable. The name Martel was spoken with respect and with a certain fear across Gaul and beyond. And in the quiet aftermath, as the banners were gathered and the dead laid to rest, the hammer's gaze turned not only to the borders, but to the throne itself. The Merovingian kings still ruled in name, but after Tours, all knew where the real power lay. The crown reforged, Pepin the Short, and the birth of a new dynasty. The triumph at Tours had done more than repel an invader. It had redrawn the map of power in the Frankish realm. Charles Martel's word now carried the weight of law, and his sword the promise of protection. Yet even the hammer could not wield his might forever. When he died in 741, his legacy passed to his sons, Charlemagne and Pepin. It was Pepin, short in stature but towering in ambition, who saw most clearly the truth that had been growing for decades. The Merovingian kings still wore the crown, but it was no longer theirs in spirit. The title remained with the Roi Fainéant, the do-nothing kings, but their authority was a shadow. Real governance, real defense, and real leadership flowed through the office of the mayor of the palace, the office Pepin now held. For years the arrangement had endured out of tradition. The king was sacred, anointed by the church, a living symbol of the realm's unity. But Pepin understood symbols could be remade. Why should the man who commanded the armies, who negotiated with the pope, who settled disputes between lords, bow to a figurehead who ruled only in name? The opportunity came in 751. Pepin, calculating as ever, sought not merely to seize the throne by force, but to clothe his ambition in legitimacy. He turned to the one institution powerful enough to sanctify such a change, the Roman Church. Envoys rode south to Pope Zachary, carrying Pepin's carefully framed question: who should be king? The man who holds the title, or the man who holds the power? The answer was exactly as Pepin had intended. The Pope replied that it was better for the one who actually exercised royal authority to bear the name of king as well. With this divine endorsement in hand, Pepin moved swiftly. Childeric III, last of the Merovingians, was deposed, shorn of his long sacred hair, the symbol of his royal blood. Without his flowing locks, he was no longer a king in the eyes of the Franks. The act was more than political. It was ritual humiliation, the ceremonial end of a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. In its place rose the Carolingian dynasty, bearing the name of Pepin's father, Charles Martel. The coronation took place at Soissons, where bishops anointed Pepin with holy oil, declaring him king of the Franks by the will of God and the blessing of the Church. It was the first time in Frankish history that papal authority had been used to sanctify the transfer of a crown, a precedent that would bind throne and altar together for centuries to come. Pepin's rise was more than a personal victory. It was the transformation of the Frankish realm. Where the Merovingians had drifted into ceremonial pageantry, the Carolingians promised active rule, military vigilance, and the uniting of temporal and spiritual authority. Pepin, though not as legendary a warrior as his father, proved himself a shrewd and capable monarch. He campaigned in Aquitaine, strengthened ties with the papacy, and prepared the realm for the even greater age that was to come. In the halls of the Frankish court, the old long-haired kings were already fading into memory, remembered as relics of a past that could no longer hold the realm together. In their place stood a king crowned not by birthright alone, but by the will of God's vicar on earth, a king whose dynasty would, within a generation, give the world Charlemagne, one of the greatest rulers in all of medieval history. The year 751 marked not just the fall of one house and the rise of another, but the forging of a new order, an order in which the crown rested upon the head of the man who could bear its weight, and the destiny of the Franks shifted from the shadows into the light of empire. Throne and altar. The sacred bond. forged in oil and steel. Pepin's coronation in 751 had not merely replaced one dynasty with another, it had created a covenant. The Carolingian crown had been set upon his head not by inheritance alone, but by the will of the Church. This was no ordinary exchange of power. It was the weaving together of two great forces, the royal authority of the Franks and the spiritual authority of Rome. From the moment the holy oil touched his brow, Pepin understood the nature of his reign. He was not only king by blood and sword, he was God's chosen protector of Christendom in the West. In return, the Church was not merely a distant blessing. It became the very partner of the throne, its prayers and pronouncements strengthening the king's legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the nobility alike. The bond was tested almost immediately. To the south, the Lombards pressed upon the papal territories in Italy, threatening Rome itself. Pope Stephen II, seeking a champion, did not turn to the Byzantine emperor or to distant allies. He crossed the Alps to stand in Pepin's court. It was an unprecedented act, the head of the Roman Church leaving the Eternal City to plead directly with a Frankish king. Pepin did not hesitate. The alliance was sealed not only in words, but in sacred ritual. In 754, at Saint-Denis, Pope Stephen anointed Pepin a second time, along with his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne, declaring that the Frankish royal line was chosen by God to defend the Church. This second anointing carried a powerful message. The Carolingian crown was not a temporary arrangement, but a divinely sanctioned dynasty. In answering the Pope's call, Pepin led his armies across the Alps into Lombard territory. Campaign after campaign forced the Lombards to retreat, and Pepin's victories culminated in the donation of Pepin, the formal grant of conquered lands to the papacy. These territories became the Papal States, ensuring that the Pope would rule not only as a spiritual leader, but as a temporal sovereign. This act transformed the balance of power in Europe. Never before had a Frankish king reshaped the political map for the direct benefit of the Church. The Pope now owed his safety and his earthly authority to the Carolingian crown. In return, the papacy became the ultimate source of legitimacy for Pepin and his heirs, their anointing a holy shield against rivals and rebellion. The people of the Frankish realm, many of them still only a few generations removed from pagan traditions, saw in this alliance a powerful sign. The king was no longer merely the strongest warlord, but the defender of God's order on earth. Monasteries flourished under royal protection, cathedrals rose in towns once ruled by sword alone, and the clergy became trusted advisors in both matters of the soul and matters of state. Yet this union of throne and altar was not without its costs. To be the protector of the Church was to inherit its enemies as well, a responsibility that would draw the Franks deeper into the politics of Italy, the Mediterranean, and beyond. But Pepin accepted this burden willingly, knowing that in return, his dynasty's right to rule would be sanctified in the eyes of all Christendom. By the time of his death in 768, Pepin had not only secured his own legacy, he had laid the foundation for a realm in which kingship and faith were bound together in a single purpose. The Carolingian crown would pass to his son Charles, soon to be known as Charlemagne, and the sacred alliance between royal and papal power would reach heights unseen since the days of Constantine. The oil of anointing had dried upon Pepin's brow, but its mark endured, a sign that in the Frankish kingdom the sword and the cross would march side by side, defending both the body and the soul of the realm. The sword of the Franks, Charlemagne's march, across the west. When Pepin the Short passed in 768, the sacred bond between crown and altar did not wither. It passed, along with the weight of the realm, to his son Charles. Though still young, Charles bore himself with the presence of a king born for action. In time, the world would know him as Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, a ruler whose shadow would stretch across all of Western Europe. From the first days of his reign, Charles made clear that the Carolingian promise was not one of idle rule. He would wield both the sword of war and the scepter of justice, not only to preserve his inheritance, but to expand it into a realm that would bind the fragmented West beneath one authority. The alliance with the church that his father had forged gave him both divine sanction and an unshakable political foundation. The Lombards, whom Pepin had humbled, rose again in defiance, threatening the Papal States. Charles answered the Pope's call with the precision of a seasoned commander. In 774 he led his armies over the Alps, laying siege to Pavia. The Lombard king Desiderius fell, and Charles took the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself, uniting it to his Frankish realm. The papacy's protector was now also king of the Lombards, master of northern Italy. Yet Italy was only the beginning. Charles's gaze turned north and east, where the Saxons, fierce and unyielding, clung to their independence and their old gods. For decades, the Franks had skirmished with these tribes, but Charles resolved on a different course. Not mere raids, but total conquest. Campaign after campaign swept across the forests and rivers of Saxony. Villages burned, fortresses fell, and pagan shrines were torn down, replaced by Christian churches. The Saxons resisted with desperate fury, rising in repeated rebellions, but Charles met each with unflinching resolve. In time, their leaders submitted, and Saxony became part of the Frankish domain. To the west, Charles pushed into Aquitaine and the Spanish March, securing the Pyrenean frontier against both rebellious lords and the influence of the Muslim emirates beyond. In the east, his armies subdued Bavaria, whose duke had long acted as an independent prince. One by one, territories that had stood apart from Frankish authority were drawn into Charles's orbit, sometimes by treaty, more often by the relentless march of his legions. Every conquest was not merely the addition of land, but the weaving of a political and spiritual fabric. Wherever his banners flew, Charles enforced the law of the Franks, supported the spread of Christianity, and strengthened the role of bishops and abbots as the guardians of both faith and royal order. In the minds of his subjects, he was not just a conqueror, but a unifier, the one man who could impose peace upon a land that had known centuries of war. The scale of his rule became something unseen since the fall of Rome. From the shores of the Atlantic to the mountains of Bohemia, from the North Sea to the plains of Lombardy, Charles's authority stretched over a mosaic of peoples: Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, Burgundians, and more, all bound by the same ruler, the same laws, and the same faith. It was an empire in all but name, and though the title of emperor had not yet been placed upon his brow, the reality was undeniable. Charles had become the sword and shield of Western Christendom, the living proof that the legacy of Rome could be reborn in the hands of a Frankish king. In the years to come, his dominion would grow still further, and his partnership with the Church would culminate in a moment that would seal his place in history. A moment when the crown of the Caesars would be set upon his head, and the Carolingian realm would be proclaimed a new empire. The crown of the Caesars, Charlemagne and the birth of a new empire. By the closing years of the 8th century, Charlemagne's realm was more than a kingdom. It was a continent-spanning order, a union of peoples, lands, and laws under one sovereign. His sword had conquered, his justice had bound, and his alliance with the Church had sanctified it all. Yet there remained one final act that would transform his reign from the rule of a mighty king into the rebirth of an empire. That moment came in the year 800. In Rome, the seat of St. Peter, the Pope himself faced grave peril. Leo III, spiritual shepherd of Christendom, had been attacked by political enemies within the city, beaten, humiliated, and left for dead. Surviving only through divine fortune and loyal allies, Leo fled across the Alps, seeking the protection of the one ruler whose power could silence Rome's chaos: Charlemagne. The Frankish king welcomed him with honor, guarding him as both guest and sacred figure. But Charlemagne understood that this was more than an act of hospitality. It was an opportunity to cement, before all Christendom, the sacred partnership between throne and altar that his father had forged. He escorted Leo back to Rome, restored him to his seat, and in doing so, placed himself as the undisputed defender of the papacy. On Christmas Day, the city gathered within the soaring arches of St. Peter's Basilica. Incense curled upward, bells pealed through the winter air, and the light of 1,000 candles danced upon marble and gold. Charlemagne knelt in prayer before the tomb of the apostle, the weight of his realm upon his shoulders. It was then that Pope Leo III stepped forward. In his hands, he bore a golden crown, not of Frankish make, but of imperial form, a symbol untouched in the West since the fall of Rome over 3 centuries before. Before the assembled clergy, nobles, and citizens, Leo placed the crown upon Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The words echoed like thunder. In that instant, Charlemagne was no longer merely king of the Franks and Lombards. He was the heir to the Caesars, the ruler of a restored Western Empire. The Church had not simply blessed his power, it had elevated him to a station that joined spiritual guardianship with imperial authority. To his supporters, it was the divine recognition of his life's work, the unification of Western Christendom under a single, God-ordained sovereign. To others, especially in the Byzantine East, it was a bold and dangerous claim, a challenge to their own imperial title. But to the people gathered in St. Peter's that day, it was a moment of awe, the closing of an age of darkness and the opening of a new era of order and faith. The coronation of 800 was more than ceremony. It was the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire, a political and spiritual entity that would endure in various forms for 1,000 years. Charlemagne's empire now carried the weight of history, the Roman legacy reborn in Frankish steel and Christian devotion. And as the choir's voices rose in triumph, Charlemagne stood crowned, cloaked not only in purple and gold, but in the knowledge that his reign had transformed the very idea of kingship. He had not just ruled, he had restored an empire, one hand clasped in the grasp of the Church, the other upon the hilt of the sword. The architect of empire, Charlemagne's reforms and the Carolingian Renaissance. The crown of the Caesars rested upon Charlemagne's brow, but he knew an empire could not be held by ceremony alone. The sword had won it, the Church had blessed it. Yet to keep it whole, he would need more than force. Steel rusts and borders shift, but law, learning, and culture can bind a realm long after the armies march home. From the moment of his coronation in 800, Charlemagne set himself to the work of building the empire he had claimed. Across the vast Frankish domains, from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to the Italian plains, he sought to weave unity from diversity. His first task was administration. No emperor could rule so many lands alone, and so Charlemagne divided his empire into regions governed by counts and dukes, loyal men charged with collecting taxes, enforcing justice, and raising troops. To ensure their loyalty and competence, he sent royal agents, the Missi Dominici, envoys of the Lord King, to travel the realm in pairs, one lay noble and one cleric, inspecting courts, hearing grievances, and delivering the emperor's word. It was a system both practical and symbolic. No power in the empire stood above the law, not even its governors. Next came legal reform. Charlemagne understood that law was the backbone of order. He issued capitularies, royal decrees, that standardized justice across his territories while still respecting local customs. These laws touched on everything from property rights to military service, from moral conduct to church governance. In this way, the empire was not a loose collection of tribes and lands, but a realm bound together under one imperial authority. Yet Charlemagne's vision reached beyond governance and into the heart of civilization itself. He was determined that his empire would not simply be large, it would be learned. Seeing the decline in literacy and scholarship since Rome's fall, he summoned the brightest minds of Christendom to his court at Aachen. From distant England came Alcuin of York, a scholar and teacher who became the architect of a cultural revival. Together they ignited what history would call the Carolingian Renaissance. Monasteries became centers not just of prayer, but of learning, their scriptoria producing beautifully illuminated manuscripts that preserved the works of the Church Fathers, Roman law, and even pagan classics. A new, clear style of handwriting, Carolingian minuscule, was developed, making texts more legible and uniform, and shaping the written word for centuries to come. Charlemagne reformed education, insisting that every cathedral and monastery maintain a school. The sons of nobles and promising commoners alike were to be taught not only Latin and scripture, but also arithmetic, music, and the liberal arts. In doing so, he planted the seeds of a literate and educated clergy and administration, the very infrastructure an enduring empire required. Religion, too, remained central to his reforms. While the sword had brought many into the fold of Christianity, Charlemagne worked to deepen their faith through instruction and discipline. He supported the standardization of liturgy, music, and church law, so that the worship of God was uniform from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The Roman Rite became the heartbeat of Christendom under his reign. In these reforms, one sees the full measure of Charlemagne's genius. He was no mere conqueror, content to add territories to his map. He was an architect of a civilization, fusing the martial strength of the Franks, the spiritual authority of the Church, and the intellectual legacy of Rome into a single, cohesive order. When foreign envoys came to Aachen, from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, from the Byzantine court in Constantinople, they found not only the throne of a warrior, but the mind of a ruler who sought to lift his people into a new golden age. Thus, the Carolingian Renaissance was born, not as a fleeting burst of art and learning, but as a deliberate act of imperial will. And as the decades passed, it became clear that Charlemagne had achieved something rare in the history of kings. He had carved his empire not only into the land, but into the very soul of his people. The breaking of the crown, the division of an empire. The Carolingian Renaissance had lit the halls of Aachen with the glow of learning, and the imperial standard had flown proudly from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. Yet even the greatest of emperors is mortal. In 814, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, Lombards, and emperor of the Romans, breathed his last. He was laid to rest in the great chapel of Aachen, clad in his imperial robes, the sword at his side, the gospel in his hands. All across the empire, bells tolled and prayers rose, for his people knew that an age had ended. The crown of the Caesars, which had rested so firmly upon his brow, now passed to his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a man of deep faith and moral conviction, a ruler who sought to govern as a Christian prince in both name and deed. Yet where his father's presence had commanded unity, Louis faced the daunting task of holding together an empire bound by the will of one extraordinary man. The vast lands, diverse peoples, and competing ambitions that Charlemagne had welded into one realm now pressed against their bonds. Louis tried to prepare for the future. According to Frankish tradition, a ruler's lands were divided among his heirs. But an empire was not a mere inheritance. It was a living order, and to divide it was to risk weakening it beyond repair. Still, Louis sought to satisfy both custom and family, arranging the Ordinatio Imperii in 817, which designated his eldest son Lothair as co-emperor, while granting sub-kingdoms to his younger sons, Pepin and Louis the German. Fate, however, would complicate these careful plans. The birth of a fourth son, Charles the Bald, to Louis's second wife ignited fierce rivalries. Brothers turned upon brothers, alliances shifted like the wind, and civil wars tore through the empire. Battles were fought not against foreign invaders, but on fields where Frankish banners faced each other in fratricidal strife. When Louis the Pious died in 840, the unity of Charlemagne's realm lay in tatters. His sons waged open war for supremacy, their quarrels culminating in the bloody Battle of Fontenoy in 841, where tens of thousands of Frankish warriors fell to their own kin. Even the solemn oaths of Strasbourg in 842, sworn in multiple languages to cement an alliance against Lothair, could not restore what had been lost. At last, exhaustion forced a settlement. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun carved the empire into three great realms. Lothair why? I retained the imperial title and received a central strip of territory, stretching from the North Sea, through the Low Countries and Burgundy, down into Italy. Louis the German took the eastern lands, the heart of what would one day be called Germany. Charles the Bald claimed the western lands, the foundations of what would become France. The division was not merely political. It was the moment when the empire's unity dissolved into the seeds of future nations. The dream of a single, undivided Christendom under one Frankish emperor was gone, replaced by competing kingdoms bound together only loosely by memory and tradition. And yet, even in division, the legacy of Charlemagne endured. His laws, his reforms, his cultural revival, these did not vanish with the redrawing of borders. Monasteries still taught in the script he had championed, churches still prayed in the liturgy he had unified, and rulers still sought legitimacy through the same alliance of crown and altar that he had perfected. Thus the empire passed from the grasp of one man into the hands of many, its crown broken, but its spirit still alive. The heirs of Charlemagne's blood might divide his lands, but they could not erase the mark he had left upon the very idea of Europe. The open gates, West Francia, and the shadow of invasion. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 had done more than divide an empire. It had fractured the shield that had once guarded Christendom's western heart. West Francia, under Charles the Bald, inherited some of the richest lands of the Frankish realm. Fertile valleys, bustling towns, and the great rivers of the Seine, Loire, and Garonne. But these blessings were also temptations. Without the unifying hand of a strong emperor, the kingdom's strength lay scattered, its defenses uneven, and its rulers forced to look inward even as threats gathered on every horizon. Charles the Bald was no fool. He understood the danger. The Carolingian system, once supported by the disciplined authority of Charlemagne and the central oversight of the Missi Dominici, had begun to fray. The counts and dukes who ruled the provinces were growing in confidence, answering less to the crown and more to their own ambitions. Loyalties became personal rather than imperial, and the bonds of obedience loosened with every passing year. It was in this climate of fragmented power that the enemies of West Francia began to test its borders. From the north, long ships cut through the mists, Vikings, hardened by the cold seas and hungry for plunder. They struck with a speed and ferocity unknown to the settled lands of the Franks, their shallow draft vessels carrying them far inland along the rivers. Cities like Rouen, Nantes, and even Paris itself would, in time, feel the sting of their raids. From the south, sails appeared on the Mediterranean horizon. Saracen raiders from the Muslim Emirates, who probed the coasts of Provence and raided deep into the valleys. They came for gold, for captives, and for the chance to strike at the Christian kingdoms that had so long resisted them. And from the east, the shifting alliances with the Middle Kingdom of Lothair and the eastern realm of Louis the German brought no peace. The borders along the Meuse and the Rhine became contested ground, where armies marched not only to repel invaders, but to settle disputes born from the treaty's uneasy lines. Charles's attempts to answer these threats were hampered by the very structure of his realm. The kingdom's defense depended on the cooperation of powerful lords, whose loyalty could not be taken for granted. In times of peril, they might rally to the king's banner, but just as often, they withheld aid, calculating their own advantage. Without a standing army in the Roman or Carolingian sense, West Francia relied on the feudal levy, a force that was slow to muster and quick to disperse. The fragmentation of authority meant that each region faced the storms of invasion in its own way. Some lords fortified their castles and negotiated truces with the raiders, buying temporary peace at the cost of gold or loyalty. Others attempted bold defenses, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer mobility of their foes. The kingdom as a whole could not present the united front that had once been the terror of Europe under Charlemagne. Yet these years of danger were also the crucible in which the medieval feudal order began to harden. In the absence of a strong central power, the people looked to their immediate lords for protection. Castles rose along riverbanks and hilltops, villages clustered within their walls, and the bonds between vassal and lord became the true fabric of survival. The king remained the theoretical sovereign, but in practice, West Francia was becoming a land of many small rulers, each guarding their corner of the realm against whatever enemy the next tide might bring. Thus, the Carolingian legacy in the West entered a new and uncertain chapter. The glory of empire had given way to the reality of vulnerability, and the fields of Francia lay open to any who dared to take them. The heirs of Charlemagne's sword would now be tested not by the dream of unity, but by the grim necessity of survival. The threefold storm, north, east, and south in flames. The weakening of West Francia's unity was like blood in the water, and the predators of Europe's frontiers could smell it. The kingdom had already felt the sting of northern longships and southern raiders, but by the closing decades of the 9th century, the danger multiplied. Now, from every horizon, the storms gathered. Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens from the south, a threefold scourge that would test the courage of kings and the endurance of their people. From the north, the Vikings came like wolves upon the fold. Their mastery of the sea was unmatched. Their longships could slice through the English Channel one week and glide silently up the Seine the next. Paris, once the jewel of the West Frankish realm, endured siege after siege. The most famous in 885-886, when hundreds of ships swarmed the river like a floating forest. These Norsemen did not simply raid. They extorted tribute, establishing fortified bases from which they could strike deeper into the heartland. In the lands along the Loire, the smoke of burning towns became an all-too-familiar sight. From the east, a new terror appeared. The Magyars. Descended from the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, they rode like the wind, their horse archers able to strike and vanish before a Frankish force could muster a defense. Their raids in the late 9th and early 10th centuries swept across Burgundy and deep into Aquitaine, leaving devastation in their wake. To the peasants of the borderlands, these riders seemed like ghosts, materializing without warning, arrows hissing through the air, then disappearing back into the mist. From the south, the Saracens, Muslim raiders and pirates from North Africa and the Emirate of Cordoba, pressed upward from the Mediterranean. They captured strongholds in Provence, seized alpine passes, and launched daring strikes against monastic treasures, whose gold and relics were as valuable to them as captives for ransom. Even the distant shrine of Saint Martin at Tours, once the spiritual heart of Gaul, felt the shadow of their approach. For Charles the Bald and his successors, the challenge was staggering. Defending one frontier was difficult. Defending three at once was nearly impossible. The Carolingian tradition of calling the great lords to war strained under the need for constant vigilance. Armies could be raised to meet one threat, but while they marched north to repel Vikings, the south would blaze with Saracen raids. While they defended the Rhone Valley, the Magyars would appear on the eastern plains. The people of West Francia adapted in grim necessity. River towns built watchtowers and palisades, peasants fled to fortified monasteries at the first sight of sails, and lords strengthened their castles into stone fortresses. This was the crucible in which medieval fortification became both an art and a lifeline. But it was also the age in which local power eclipsed royal command. For the king, harried on all fronts, could not be everywhere at once, and so the burden of defense fell to whichever lord's banner flew over the nearest hill. Yet for all the devastation, these invasions forged a harder, more self-reliant West Francia. The courage of its defenders, The resilience of its towns and the stubborn endurance of its people became a kind of unspoken identity. If the empire of Charlemagne had been born in conquest, the kingdom that followed was tempered in survival. Still, the scars ran deep. Fields lay fallow where armies had marched. Trade faltered on roads too dangerous to travel, and the coffers of both king and church were drained by the endless tribute paid to buy peace. The dream of a united Christendom seemed ever more distant, replaced by the brutal reality of defending hearth and home against the relentless tide. The fortress bargain, the birth of feudal power. The endless raids had done more than scar the land. They had reshaped the very structure of West Frankish society. In the age of Charlemagne, the emperor's authority had been the great shield of the realm. Now, that shield was fractured, and the people could no longer look to the distant crown for swift salvation. When the sails of the Northmen appeared on the horizon, when Magyar horsemen thundered across the plains, or when Saracen banners glimmered in the southern sun, it was not the king's army that came first. It was the nearest lord's banner, rising above the walls of a keep. In this crucible of fear and necessity, a new order hardened. Feudalism. The system had roots deep in Frankish custom, but now it became the dominant reality of life. Power and protection flowed not from the imperial court, but from the fortified halls of local lords. For the peasants, the choice was stark. Alone, a village was nothing but fuel for the enemy's torch. The longships could beach on any riverbank. Horsemen could ride through open fields without warning. To survive, peasants sought the shelter of the castle, offering labor, crops, and loyalty in exchange for a place within its walls when danger came. In doing so, they bound themselves to the lord's service, their freedom often narrowed, but their lives spared. For the townsfolk, the bargain was much the same. Markets and workshops clustered under the shadow of strongholds, where the lord's garrison could guard both goods and families. In times of peace, the lord's authority regulated trade and settled disputes. In times of war, the town gates closed, and every able hand took up arms. The lords, in turn, drew their strength from the loyalty and labor of those they protected. A network of vassalage expanded, where lesser nobles swore fealty to greater ones, and all owed military service in return for land or privileges. At the top of this chain still stood the king, but his power was now woven through a web of mutual obligations rather than commanded outright. The castle became the true center of power, not only a military bastion, but the beating heart of administration, justice, and economy. Stone by stone, wooden palisade by wooden palisade, the landscape of West Francia transformed into a patchwork of fortified domains. These fortresses were both havens and symbols, their towers visible for miles, promising protection to those who served and warning outsiders of the strength within. But this protection came at a cost. Freedom, in the modern sense, was rare. The bonds between lord and peasant, master and vassal, were as binding as iron chains. To leave one's land without permission was to risk losing all protection, a sentence that could be as good as death in an age of constant peril. The church, too, adapted to this new reality. Monasteries fortified their walls, bishops became lords in their own right, and abbots commanded soldiers alongside their prayers. In this merging of sacred and martial power, the medieval order took on its characteristic form. God's law and the sword, working hand in hand to maintain a fragile peace. By the dawn of the 10th century, the people of West Francia no longer spoke of the empire as their protector. They spoke of their lord. The bond between protector and protected, forged in the fire of invasion, became the foundation upon which the kingdom's future would stand. Thus, the invasions that had threatened to tear West Francia apart instead crystallized a new, enduring system. Feudalism was not born from theory or royal decree. It was born from necessity, from the hard truth that survival belonged to those who could defend themselves and their own. The patchwork crown, lands of the lords. The bargain of protection had saved West Francia from complete ruin, but it had also sown the seeds of a new political reality, one that would outlast kings and even dynasties. What had once been a kingdom united under a single crown was now a mosaic of feudal domains, each ruled by a lord who held his land not as a steward of the king, but as a master in his own right. The invasions had taught the people to look first to their immediate protector, and the lords had risen to meet that need. But they had also grown in ambition. Castles that had begun as desperate refuges now became permanent centers of power. Around them, estates expanded, villages multiplied, and the boundaries of each domain were marked not by royal decree, but by the reach of a lord's sword. The king's authority still existed, but it was now an authority negotiated rather than imposed. To levy troops, the king had to call upon his vassals, who in turn summoned their own. Every chain of obligation led downward to the peasants who tilled the fields and upward to the lords who could, and often did, decide whether to obey the summons at all. A weak king might find himself little more than the first among equals, his word competing with those of dukes, counts, and margraves whose fortresses dominated their regions. The realm became a patchwork of principalities. The Duke of Aquitaine ruled lands so vast they rivaled the king's own in wealth. The Count of Flanders commanded the trade routes of the northern coast, enriching his coffers while defending his harbors from Viking incursions. In the southeast, the margraves of Provence stood as both bulwark against Saracen raids and power unto themselves, their loyalty to the crown often conditional. In some cases, the king strengthened his hold by granting vast territories to loyal followers, but in doing so, he planted the roots of future independence. Once granted, these lands were rarely surrendered, and the lords who held them guarded their rights with the same zeal they defended their castles. The countryside itself reflected this new order. Roads that once carried imperial officials now wound between 100 different jurisdictions, each with its own tolls, laws, and customs. A merchant traveling from Paris to Bordeaux might pass through the domains of half a dozen lords, paying tribute at each gate, swearing temporary allegiance at each fortress. The church, too, held its share of this feudal patchwork. Bishops and abbots were not only spiritual shepherds, but also feudal lords, owning vast estates and commanding their own vassals. In some places, ecclesiastical lords became rivals to secular ones, in others, allies. But always, they were players in the same game of land, loyalty, and power. This dispersion of authority was not without its benefits. Local lords could react swiftly to threats in their domains, their armies ready at a moment's notice. They knew the needs of their lands intimately, and in times of royal weakness, it was their leadership that kept the countryside from descending into anarchy. Yet the price of this system was fragmentation. West Francia was a kingdom in name, but in truth it was a federation of semi-independent powers. A strong king could harness this network to project might across the realm. A weak king could be ignored, defied, or even overruled within his own borders. The crown's writ no longer ran uninterrupted from the Pyrenees to the Channel. Instead, it meandered, bending around the territories of proud lords, dipping into some valleys while bypassing others entirely. The unity forged by Clovis and crowned by Charlemagne had been replaced by a balance of power, precarious, shifting, and ever at risk of shattering. Thus, the realm of West Francia entered an age where the castle wall was mightier than the royal seal, and where the fortunes of the kingdom would depend as much on the ambitions of its great lords as on the wisdom of its king. The crown of trust, a throne bound by oaths, the patchwork realm of West Francia glittered with castles and bristled with banners, but at its heart, the crown itself grew lighter. Not from gold lost, but from authority drained. The king still wore it, yet its weight was no longer the burden of command. It was the fragile balance of trust. For in this age of fortified domains and proud lords, a king's power depended less on his own will and more on the loyalty of his vassals. Where once an imperial decree could summon armies from every corner of the realm, now it summoned only those willing to answer. The great dukes and counts held their troops not in the name of the king, but in the name of their own fiefs, their own survival. When the king called, they weighed the summons against their own interests. Would answering strengthen their position, or weaken it? Would the king reward their loyalty, or use it to curb their independence? The royal court became as much a place of negotiation as of governance. Feasts and councils were less about imperial vision and more about binding oaths, settling disputes between lords and ensuring that alliances held firm. The king's skill as a ruler was measured as much in his ability to persuade as to command. On the battlefield, this reliance was even more precarious. A king could not march without his vassals, and yet those vassals might arrive late, leave early, or not come at all if their own lands faced threats. In moments of crisis, the kingdom's fate could hinge on whether a single powerful lord deemed the king's cause worth his swords. This decentralized loyalty gave West Francia both resilience and fragility. When united under a charismatic or respected monarch, the network of lords could project immense strength, each domain contributing men and resources in coordinated force. But when the crown passed to a weaker heir, or when rival claims divided the realm, the same structure could dissolve into feuds, with vassals pursuing their own rivalries while the king's pleas went unanswered. The church, which might once have served as the empire's unifying conscience, now played its own part in these delicate politics. Bishops and abbots were themselves vassals, holding lands and owing military service. Their loyalty, like that of the secular lords, could be courted, bargained for, or lost. A king who fell out of favor with the church risked not only spiritual condemnation, but also the withdrawal of armed support from some of the wealthiest landholders in the realm. Yet for all this, the crown retained a symbolic power that could not be dismissed. The king was still the anointed of God, crowned in sacred ceremony, the ultimate arbiter of disputes between lords, if they agreed to abide by his judgment. His court remained the place where noble titles were confirmed, where marriages between great houses were arranged, where the language of fealty was spoken even as the reality of independence deepened. It was a delicate dance. The king needed his vassals as much as they needed the legitimacy only he could grant. In this mutual dependence lay both the stability and the danger of the realm. One betrayal, one broken oath, could shift the balance entirely, and in an age when every lord commanded his own fortress and army, such a shift could change the fate of the kingdom overnight. Thus, the kings of West Francia ruled not by the unshakable might of their forebears, but by the fragile threads of loyalty, spun from promises, reinforced by honor, and frayed by ambition. The throne still stood, but its legs rested not on the solid stone of imperial power. They rested on the shifting ground of men's word, men's pride, and men's gain. The crown reforged. The rise of Hugh Capet. By the closing years of the 10th century, the throne of West Francia was no longer the inheritance of an unbroken imperial line. The Carolingians, heirs of Charlemagne, had dwindled in both power and prestige. Their claim to the crown rested more on memory than on mastery. Real authority had shifted into the hands of the great nobles, and the kingship itself had become a prize to be decided not by blood alone, but by the consent, or calculation, of those lords who truly held the realm in their grasp. It was in this crucible of fractured loyalties and fading royal command that Hugh Capet emerged. Son of Hugh the Great, Duke of the Franks, Hugh Capet was not the most powerful lord in the realm. The dukes of Normandy and counts of Flanders could match or even surpass him in wealth and troops. But he possessed something rarer, a reputation for pragmatism, steadiness, and unshakable political sense. The last Carolingian king, Louis V, died in 987 without an heir, leaving the crown vacant. The lords of West Francia gathered to decide who would wear it next. In theory, the crown should have passed to Charles of Lorraine, a Carolingian prince. But Charles had long been tied to the court of the German emperor and was seen by many as a foreign pawn. In an age when the kingdom needed a ruler rooted in its soil, such a connection was poison. The magnates weighed their options. They needed a king who could balance the power of rival houses, one who would not overshadow them but also not dissolve into weakness. Hugh Capet fit that mold perfectly. He commanded respect without commanding fear, his lands lying at the heart of the realm around Paris and Orléans, a strategic center from which the monarchy could grow if given time. In the summer of 987, the Assembly of Nobles made its choice. Hugh Capet was elected King of the Franks, not by the divine inevitability of dynastic inheritance, but by the collective will of the realm's power brokers. The ceremony in Noyon, with its solemn anointing and oath-taking, marked not only the crowning of a man, but the birth of a new dynasty. The Capetians, who would rule France in an unbroken line for more than 3 centuries. Yet this was no instant transformation of the monarchy. Hugh's power, like that of his Carolingian predecessors, was still bound by the oaths of his vassals. His authority outside his personal domains was fragile, his decrees enforceable only where local lords agreed to uphold them. But Hugh possessed the patience of a builder, not the recklessness of a conqueror. He understood that the crown he wore was less a weapon than a seed, one that would need generations to take root. The realm he inherited was still a patchwork of feudal principalities, its unity as much an aspiration as a reality. But by placing the crown in the hands of the Capetians, the nobles had unknowingly set in motion a process that would, over centuries, draw these lands together under a single, stronger monarchy. For now, Hugh ruled as a first among equals, careful to avoid threatening the great lords who had elevated him. He used marriage alliances to weave connections between rival houses, reinforced the sacred prestige of kingship through close ties with the church, and maintained his base of strength in the Ile-de-France, a compact, well-defended heartland from which the Capetians would slowly expand their influence. Thus began the Capetian era, not with a thunderclap of conquest, but with the quiet, deliberate choice of men who sought stability in a time of uncertainty. Hugh Capet's reign would not transform the kingdom overnight, but it would anchor the monarchy in a lineage that endured where others had fallen. From this small foundation, the crown of France would one day grow mighty again, but in 987 it was enough that the throne still stood, and that a king, chosen and anointed, still bore it, a crown in a fortress. The Ile-de-France stronghold. Hugh Capet's election in 987 had placed the Capetian crown upon his head, but the true measure of his realm could be taken not by the grandeur of his title, but by the narrow boundaries of his direct domain. The King of the Franks was, in practice, lord of little more than the compact region of the Ile-de-France, a fertile heartland surrounding Paris, stretching only a few days' ride in any direction. Beyond its fields and towns lay the vast and semi-independent territories of dukes, counts, and margraves, each as jealous of their autonomy as they were wary of the crown's ambitions. Hugh understood this reality with a clarity that had eluded many kings before him. His rule did not begin with grand campaigns to reclaim lost authority. Such efforts would have been crushed beneath the combined resistance of the great lords. Instead, he set about fortifying what he truly possessed, making the Ile-de-France not merely a homeland, but a fortress of royal legitimacy. The geography of his realm was a blessing. The Seine wound through the land like a silver artery, linking Paris to the sea and the trade routes beyond. The fertile plains fed the population, while a network of fortified towns provided both economic lifeblood and military security. Castles rose not as symbols of royal overreach into other lords' territories, but as anchors within his own, binding the loyalty of local knights and freeholders directly to the king. In this secure heartland, Hugh and his successors cultivated the ritual of kingship. Every act, the holding of court in Paris, the anointing of heirs, the solemn coronations at Reims, was designed to remind both subjects and vassals that the crown was not a prize to be passed at whim, but a sacred office, enduring and divinely sanctioned. The king might be weak in the reach of his sword, but in the symbolism of his reign, he was unassailable. The early Capetians also wove a web of alliances and marriages, binding their line to other noble houses without challenging them outright. They avoided unnecessary wars, choosing instead to let rival lords exhaust themselves in disputes, while the monarchy remained a steady, if modest, center of authority. In an age of feudal rivalry, even the appearance of neutrality could draw lesser lords into the crown's orbit, seeking arbitration or favor. Still, the limitations were stark. The Dukes of Normandy, the Counts of Flanders, the Dukes of Aquitaine, each commanded more men and richer lands than the king himself. Royal justice could be ignored in far-off provinces. Royal taxes could be refused if a lord felt secure behind his own walls. The Capetian monarchs learned to govern with patience, using time as their greatest weapon. For every generation the crown endured, its legitimacy deepened, and with it opportunities to expand its reach would come. And expand it eventually would, though not through the sweeping conquests of Charlemagne's age, but through centuries of careful accumulation. The early kings laid claim to any land that reverted to the crown through inheritance, confiscation, or lack of heirs, slowly expanding the royal domain piece by piece. They nurtured the cities of their domain, recognizing that wealth and trade could become as decisive as armies in asserting royal influence. For now, the Ile-de-France remained the monarchy's anchor in a sea of fractious feudalism. The Capetians guarded it fiercely, for in its towns, its markets, and its churches lay the resources and the image of stability that would one day allow the crown to challenge even the mightiest of its vassals. The path ahead would be long, marked by setbacks and rivalries, but the foundation had been set. By securing a small but loyal core, Hugh Capet and his heirs had done more than merely survive. They had planted the roots of a centralized kingdom that, in time, would stretch far beyond the borders of their modest realm. The lords of the 10th century had chosen a king they believed would remain weak. Instead, they had given birth to a dynasty that would, in the fullness of centuries, gather the whole of France beneath its banner. And so, with his crown secured upon a narrow but steadfast realm, Hugh Capet stood as the final link in a chain forged across 5 centuries of turmoil, a chain whose first links had been hammered in the ashes of Rome itself. From ashes to a crown, the birth of a nation. From the smoldering ruins of Rome's departure in 476 to the quiet but decisive election of Hugh Capet in 987, the land we now call France had traveled through centuries of chaos, conquest, and transformation. The legions had marched away, and with them went the order of imperial law and the weight of centralized rule. In their place came the storms of migration and invasion. Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians, Vikings, Saracens, and Magyars, each reshaping the destiny of Gaul with sword and settlement. Clovis had risen from the maelstrom, uniting the Frankish tribes under one banner, forging an alliance with the Catholic Church, and laying the first stones of a kingdom that spanned most of Gaul. The Merovingians that followed squandered much of that unity. Their crown weakened until real power lay in the hands of palace mayors. Charles Martel had revived the realm's spirit with the thunder of his victory at Tours, and Pepin the Short had formally replaced a faltering dynasty with the Carolingians, a line that reached its zenith under Charlemagne, whose empire stretched across Western Europe. Yet Charlemagne's legacy, too, fragmented. Division among heirs and relentless external threats splintered West Francia into a mosaic of fiercely independent fiefs. The crown became less a symbol of command than a fragile pact among equals, its survival dependent on the shifting loyalties of ambitious vassals. For generations, kings ruled only in name, their authority bound to the narrow limits of their personal domains. And then, in a hall in Noyon, the lords of the realm made a choice. In 987, Hugh Capet was crowned, not as an emperor of a united land, but as the guardian of a modest kingdom anchored in the Ile-de-France. To some, his election seemed the beginning of a pliable monarchy, a throne easy to contain. Yet history would prove otherwise, for in that small and fortified heartland lay the seeds of France's future. The Capetians would rule with patience, wielding not the sudden sword of conquest, but the slow, deliberate tools of dynasty. Marriage, diplomacy, calculated inheritance. They would guard their crown through centuries of feudal rivalry, outlasting stronger lords until the balance shifted and the king once more stood above all. The story of these 5 centuries is not one of unbroken triumph, but of endurance. A people and a crown surviving the fall of an empire, weathering the age of invasion, and enduring the suffocating grip of feudal division until the moment came to rise again. From the ashes of Rome, through the chaos of the Franks, Carolingians, and feudal lords, a single unbroken line had been forged. The Capetian crown, fragile though it was in its first years, would in time draw all the scattered banners of West Francia into one. The kings who wore it would be the architects of a nation, and the land that had once been a prize for conquerors would become a kingdom that no invader could claim. France was not yet whole, but it was born.